Yesterday, I was watching series four of The Crown, and one of the episodes deals with Michael Fagan. It's the second time I've seen the episode. Initially, I saw it on Netflix, and then I got the DVD. Um, but one of the strengths of The Crown, I'll just say this in passing, is that there was these sort of standalone episodes that weren't really directly connected to the royal family, but they were interesting and significant nonetheless. Um, and I think that's one of the strengths of The Crown. It wasn't formulaic, it wasn't predictable. Each episode was different. So it wasn't just that, okay, it's another episode, it's another royal family saga. This was dealing with, a lot of episodes dealt with things outside of the main framework of the royal family. So in this particular episode, for those who aren't familiar, Michael Fagan was a man who broke into Buckingham Palace in the early 80s. I think it was 1982, because it was around the same time as the Falklands. And he actually done it twice. Now, of course, for a TV production, you're going to have some exaggeration. You're going to have a bit of artistic license. And in the program, it shows him having quite a lengthy conversation with the Queen before there was an intermission. Now, he did actually intervention, I should say. He did speak to the Queen very briefly, although it wasn't quite like the program showed. But that's beside the point. What I liked about the show is it didn't just portray Fagin as some nut. It gave a context why he done what he done. I still think it was extraordinary measure they took, and it was a shocking lack of security. He could have been anyone. Um, in the event, I think he was only charged of theft of a bottle of wine and trespass. There was no major sort of consequences for this. 200 years ago, he would have been transported to Australia probably. But he himself said that he was a normal man and he was just tired of circumstances. Again, there was a bit of artistic license to his precise circumstances. For example, the program shows he was in a bitter custody battle, and it basically showed a man who was frustrated, whose life was falling apart. It showed him going to the job centre, which in those days were pretty grim. Not that they're ever cheery places, but always giving sarcastic answers because he was fed up of not being able to get work and the very sort of dismissive job center advisor, next, etc. Um, and it showed, like I say, the custody battle with his partner over children, his frustration at trying to improve the living standards, and it just showed a man who was angry and frustrated. One scene it showed him getting into a fist fight with his partner's new boyfriend in the playground, things like this. And there was also a scene where he confronted the MP. Now, there is a bit of artistic license there because Faig's own MP wasn't actually a conservative. That was a bit of artistic license. But the guy basically talks about his boss being Thatcher and then ultimately being the Queen. So that basically gives Fagan its idea of going in. It is artistic license, but there is definitely important talking points with that episode, and I'm using it as a basis for this. Um, yes, about Thatcherism, but about conservatism more generally. Throughout the episode, it shows Thatcher's being triumphant because of her victory in the Falklands, but at the end, she has her weekly audience with the Queen. This is Thatcher, played by Gillian Anderson. Superb performance by her. Olivia Colman as the Queen, and so she gets into this, lecture about how security must improve and how malcontents must be put down and so on. And the Queen says, "Oh, but he wasn't violent." And you're left with the impression the Queen actually quite felt some sympathy with Fagin. Whether she did or not, we'll never really know. The Queen didn't do interviews. We'll never really know if that was the case or not. And the conversation was a lot more limited than the programme implies. Um, but I do think the Queen wasn't as oblivious to what was going on in society as some Republicans might think. I mean, for instance, it's well known on policy matters the Queen and Thatcher differed on the approach to apartheid. That's well documented. it's often said the Queen and Thatcher did not get on well, as they were the two powerful women at the top. Again, both camps have tried to dampen that, but who knows? Who knows? Anyway, the mantra that Thatcher kept coming out with was about self-reliance and pulling yourself together. And I think it's one of the things that her supporters admire, but they also have a blind spot to this. They never really understood or understand that that condescending attitude that Thatcher had was quite bitter to a lot of people. Um, you know, people were unemployment was in the millions. Homelessness rose on her watch. I think that Thatcher's supporters they sort of admire her as a strong woman. They admire the fact she stood up to communism. They admire her wartime leadership, etc. And there is things to admire about Thatcher, but the way I mean, this video is not meant to be an analysis of purely of Margaret Thatcher as Prime Minister, but I will say it in passing. I think that her critics can sometimes vilify her too much and totally disregard any of the good that she done. She did put Britain back on the map. In the 1970s, we were in a bad way. She did make us a great power again. You know, she was one of the most significant figures of the late 20th century. It's undeniable. Standing up to the Soviet Union was absolutely morally right. And I do believe intervention in the Falklands was justified. You had a fascist dictator invade the island. You had people there who, by democratic will, identified as British. That was their sovereign democratic right to do so. Um, Even Michael Foot admitted that he recognised a fascist when he saw one, referring to Galtieri. So I think the Falklands War was justified. It wasn't good. War is never good. A lot of young men died, but I don't think any British Prime Minister could have turned a blind eye when Argentina invaded the island. Um, but I do think Thatcher's supporters are quite oblivious or that they have a serious blind spot when it comes to legitimate criticism. When she spoke about striking minors as moaning minis, that awful condescending attitude she came out with. I mean, it's worth noting that in the end it was her own cabinet got rid of her because she was just so tone deaf to public opinion. The poll tax just went too far. Thatcher's attitude, as it always was a battle axe. She wasn't willing to listen to anyone. And the thing is, there is some merit in the argument you can't lead from the back, you have to lead from the front. And Thatcher was a very powerful force of personality. And there is something to be said for that. We've seen what happens with weak leaders. It's not a good thing. But strength doesn't mean being so stubborn that you never listen to anyone else. And I think one of Thatcher's problems, particularly in the end, was she just got utterly tone deaf. Um, and that was a problem. Now, the thing that about self-reliance, and this is something she always emphasized, Thatcher was from a middle class background. Her father famously was a grocer. Um, she had a lot of admiration for the self-made man, and why wouldn't you? I mean, that is something to admire. There are numerous individuals in history who got great success by being self-made. Andrew Carnegie is a famous example. He started off in humble origins, became the second richest man in the world at the time, and he was a great philanthropist, not without controversy. What mega billionaire isn't without controversy? But I think there is something to be said for the self-made man. I don't count Donald Trump self-made because he got a small loan of $1 million, and it might have been even more. So that is hardly, a modest start. Um, Plus, his father was already a prominent businessman, so I wouldn't count him as a self-made man. Um, there's definitely something to be said for that. There's also something to be said about, considering what you could do for yourself rather than relying on others. There's definitely something to be said for that. If you're in a survival situation, like I don't know, a shipwreck or a mountain, you're abandoned on a mountain or something, and there's the situation where others aren't coming, you really have no choice but to pull it together. I've watched a show called I Shouldn't Be Alive, which is about these survival situations, and it's admirable the sheer human spirit, the strength of will that people have to overcome these awful situations. But that's fine. That's in extreme circumstances. The problem with Thatcherism and the problem with, I think, a number of conservative sins is this attitude that one size fits all, and also this attitude that because there are people who can, build up their own success, then everyone can. And it's this hostility to any sort of state intervention that, oh, it's just a handout, or it's, encouraging laziness, or I think that's misses the point. If you have high unemployment, it's all very well saying to the unemployed, just go out and get a job. But there's another side to that. There's another component, which is employers have to offer jobs. Now, if someone's applying for job after job and they're simply not getting offers, then can you reasonably blame anyone for having low spirits? Can you reasonably blame anyone for having low motivation? The problem I have with this mindset of pull yourself together, it can be quite callous and it can be quite cold because it doesn't take into account mental health for one thing, but it also disregards the fact that people do have different circumstances. Um, no, I'm not someone who believes in always blaming other people and always saying it's the fault of the state, it's the fault of the police, etc. Although when it comes to the justice system, I definitely think that the justice establishment has a lot to answer for. Um, but it's that sort of mindset of to hell with the notion of helping people. It's like there's something very callous about it. And I would say this about the Conservative Party, and I think it's pretty much been true since the days of Thatcher. Um, and actually, it's been true of New Labour as well. I would argue Starmer's Labour Party may not be called New Labour, but the way Rachel Reeves and Liz Kendall are treating disabled claimants is no better than Thatcherism. It really isn't. I think it's utterly contemptible. I mean, Kendall basically came out with the same attitude. Oh, I believe that most disabled claimants can work. So it's this idea of it's dressed up as kind of being tough love, but it's a lack of empathy. It's a lack of understanding of the situation someone is in. If someone is suffering the chronic pain of fibromyalgia, expecting them to do a 9 to 5 job and function in that way is absurd. Possibly some people can do certain jobs. That's true. But that sweeping statement that Kendall made was outrageous. I'm talking about the Tories in this video, but Labour is really not much better. Um, so basically, what I want to argue here is that self-reliance is a good thing. Not overly relying on others is a good thing, but I see nothing honourable or noble or sensible about turning away the notion of help when someone really does need it. Put it this way, if there was a family whose, let's say, children were starving, this is an extreme example. Let's say the father had that sort of mindset, oh, I'm not going to ask the state for anything, but his children are literally starving. Could be because he's being made redundant or something. Who knows? This is obviously an extreme example, but I do think it underlines the point. Now, if the father had that mindset of I don't believe in taking money from the state, then he would literally, or she, if it's a mother, put their so-called principles over the security of their children in that sense. I mean, what's admirable about that? It's absolutely, and I find that all the people who are most judgmental about claimants have never been in their shoes. They've never experienced unemployment. They've never experienced that sort of situation. I'm not talking about people who are talking about benefit fraud. I'm talking about people who just vilify all claimants. In fact, I've put it to them. I've said, how would you feel if you were in this position? Have you ever been unemployed? And they say it with pride. No, I've never been unemployed. Because they look down on unemployed people. So they have this arrogant. self-righteousness and this arrogant sense of complacency. Um, but something like redundancy, particularly in certain fields, can happen to anyone. So nobody should stick their nose up at the unemployed if they've not been through it. Same with homelessness. Um, I'm going to wrap this up soon, but I just think that with Thatcherism and with a lot of conservative thinking since then, and some Labour ministers as well, it's this attitude of one size fits all. That person can do it, so why can't you? But it isn't taken into account different circumstances, different life experiences. Um, I deeply dislike that survival of the fittest mindset. And that's how I describe it, because it's this idea that, well, people who are helping themselves, we should admire and praise them. People who are struggling, well, it must be their own fault. If they're homeless, they must just be a junkie. If they're unemployed, they must be lazy. That, I honestly believe, is how conservatives tend to look at problems. Now, I want to be clear on this point. I am not saying every single conservative is a callous, indifferent person. Not at all. Okay, I want to be very clear on that. Of course, there will be plenty of conservatives who are decent people, who help their neighbours, who give to charity, and so on. But I do think the general mindset of the Conservative Party, and frankly, Labour parties that have been in power since 1997, has been that sort of mindset of, if you're struggling, it must be your own fault. There is just a lack of compassion. In the 1940s, late 40s, 50s, when the welfare state was set up, it was set up as a safety net. It wasn't set up to be weaponized to punish people who were struggling. And yes, there are people who abuse it, which is wrong. I've always condemned that. But for everyone who willfully commits benefit fraud, there's also someone who genuinely needs it. And punishing them and trying to make them feel like they're a criminal is just wrong. It's just, telling seriously disabled people that they're fit to work. In some cases, even people who've been critically ill on their deathbed have got letters from the DWP telling them they're fit to work. It's this pathetic, callous computer says no attitude. And the DWP never admits its mistakes. It's if a claimant is 10 minutes late for any sort of interview, they risk losing money because there's ever threat, ever present threat of sanctions. And yet, if they're late, if they say we're going to phone you at 2 o'clock and it's actually half two or three, a decent advisor might apologise, but some of them don't bother. So there's absolutely double standards in that regard. Um, so I do say that there is something to be said for self-reliance, being practical, working hard. Well, it's all good, of course it is. Um, and I'm also a believer that some people are too sensitive and just complain too much, and look for reasons to be offended and so on. So I'm not in favor of that. I'm not in favor of being hypersensitive and always looking for reasons to complain and always blaming someone else. It is a bad way to look at the world. I think it's very healthy to teach children to take responsibility and acknowledge their own shortcomings. That's healthy. But but sometimes compassion is important. Sometimes there does need to be intervention from the state. Sometimes um, people just need a helping hand up without being told, well, you're on your own, best wishes, pull yourself together. It's just callous and dismissive. And too many Tories think that. And to those conservatives who don't think that way, I would say, okay, but at least acknowledge your party has a record of doing it. And to those Labour figures who do it, I think, it's not why people vote for the Labour Party. People like Rachel Reeves and Liz Kendall, I very much doubt people voted for the Labour Party to see the Work and Pension Secretary and the Chancellor cracking down hard on disabled claimants. It's a disgrace. And it's one thing I really take issue with Starmer's government. Now I'm going to wrap this up, but yeah, I just think survival of the fittest and pull yourself together in its worst manifestation, it's particularly the latter. It's just callous, ignorant, and dismissive. to the problems that people face. I mean, if your neighbour's house is on fire, let me use this analogy. You're not going to say, "Oh well, there's a river nearby. Just go down and get water." Pull yourself together. Don't complain about it. No, you would help them to put it out if you were any sort of decent person. The problem with Thatcherism is it just took this mindset of self-reliance too far, to the point of, if someone's struggling, it must be their own fault, and they're just a whiner. I think it was contemptible how she referred to striking miners who were trying to feed their families as moaning minis. And her supporters do have a blind spot. They just won't acknowledge the reasons why she's such a controversial figure. They want to focus on some of the good things she's done, like availability of first home ownership and standing up to the Soviets and things like that. Um, anyway, that's it. Let me know your thoughts.